I'm Dr. Stacey Ote Scott here with Stress Less with Dr. SOS. We're continuing with part 2 of our special series called The Talk. The Talk is designed to help promote healthy conversation and provoke intentional action as we all address the issues of racial inequality and social injustice in America. For some, the talk is the conversation that parents have with their children about sex and sexuality. This is somewhat of a universal conversation that all parents eventually have with their children as they get older in hopes of assisting them with making wise decisions as sexual beings. However, there is another talk that's required of Black and brown parents that's usually had long before this conversation about the birds and the bees. The talk speaks directly to the racial discrimination and police brutality that minorities experience on a daily basis in our country. The purpose of the talk is to instruct our children on how to respond as opposed to react in a racially charged situation, particularly when it involves law enforcement. The value of the talk can literally be the difference between life and death for an African American man, woman, or child if they make one wrong move, or, as we've seen more and more frequently, even if they don't. We've learned that making all of the right moves or no move at all does not ensure that those of us with Black and brown faces will make it home safely. All of us have witnessed the ongoing protests and rallies that were set off by the very visible murder of George Floyd as a Minneapolis police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while the world watched his life literally leave his body. Watching Mr. Floyd and an ever-increasing list of other Black men and women continue to die right in front of our eyes has been a shocking, yet not surprising experience. As we replay these scenes over and over on our computer screens and mobile devices, we experience a visceral and traumatic response that may best be labeled as vicarious trauma, accompanied with feelings of anger, rage, grief, and sadness. While this experience is challenging for anyone who bears witness to this unimaginable cruelty, research on African Americans and African American males suggests that they're particularly vulnerable to the negative impact of racism on their mental, emotional, and physical health. Our Black and brown men and boys are experiencing increased amounts of emotional distress as they witness the systematic emasculation and killing of mirror images of themselves, and it's both painful and heartbreaking. But as people of color, we are resilient. So how can we best support our fathers, grandfathers, and uncles as they have the talk with their sons, grandsons, and nephews? Let's start by encouraging them to be open and honest with themselves and their children. And let's remind them that in the sharing of their pain, they also have the ability to instill hope and words of wisdom to the next generation.
I'm disgusted.
I get why you're disgusted. I'm disgusted also. All the different reactions we're getting out there just doesn't seem right. But I think if we put our heads together, come up with some great ideas, and just communicate it one person at a time, we can make a difference.
I am devastated.
I understand, son. I'm devastated also with the brutal torture of Mr. George Floyd, and we are demanding justice.
I'm confused. To be fair, I'm just as confused as you are. In today's America, where people care more about buildings and animals than about human life, especially Black lives and people of color, something has to change. This is not the way we should be. This is not America.
I feel bad.
It's okay to feel bad, man. I feel bad as well. But just as I've always taught you, no matter what's going on in the world, we gotta do what's right. So together, you and I will continue to stand for justice.
I'm disappointed.
Son, it's okay to be disappointed. I'm disappointed too. We've been promised equality, but we've not yet received it. But together, you and I will continue to push for change.
I don't know what to feel.
I understand, son. It's okay to not know what to feel. I've been there. Should you feel anger or sadness, be vengeful or forgiving, open-minded or heartless? These are all things that you could feel. But even though you may not know what to feel, just know that I love you, and we will all get through this together.
Today, I've asked my husband, Jason, to join me as we share a bit more on helpful ways to have the talk with your children. Jason, one of the recommendations on having the talk with children is that we start early. Children notice differences all around them at a relatively young age, and one of those differences is color. Some studies show that by age 4, children can start showing signs of racial bias. About how old were our boys when you started having the talk with them?
With our boys, I started from the time they were born. I wanted to teach them who they were before the world had a chance to teach them who they were. And also I wanted to teach them about the biases that the world was going to have as it looked at them as young black men. One of the distinctions I made with each of my sons was that they were young black men. I wasn't raising boys. That wasn't my job. My job was to raise young black men. And so I gave them identity immediately. From the time I was reading to them at nighttime, I started having that conversation with them.
Another recommendation when teaching and talking to kids about race is, as the parent, you have to be willing to face your own biases. When we face our own biases, we're less likely to pass them down. As you know, I have a saying that you can't fix what you won't admit. How has this played out in your life?
Well, certainly we all have our own biases. And lucky for me that I've had you to help me walk through some of those biases. But certainly as a kid, I was bullied. And I grew up in an all-white neighborhood in the suburbs. And thank you to my parents for raising me in the suburbs, because it was fantastic. However, I encountered that racial bias very, very early. By the time I was 7 years old, it was pointed out to me that I lived in a neighborhood in which there weren't very many black kids. And so I was picked on. Mm-hmm. And from that bullying, I certainly developed biases that I carried with me through to adulthood. So it was very helpful to me to understand what those biases were, to go back to deal with those biases so that I could not allow my experiences to build barriers, but to build bridges. Certainly the vast majority of my close friends were not African American. They were Italian American, they were Irish American, they were everything but African American, just because of the neighborhood I grew up in. So identifying those biases, making choices on where we lived, mm-hmm. making sure that we lived in an area that was very diverse. Mm-hmm. We turned down opportunities to move to less diverse parts of the country so that our children could experience diversity and all the strength that comes from it.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings me up to another recommendation. The recommendation is that we move beyond simply talking to our kids about issues of discrimination and racism, and we make sure that we are modeling the kinds of behaviors we want them to embrace. I frequently remind parents that kids do what they see, not what we say. So making sure we're creating an environment that supports diversity means that we need to be willing to engage in healthy relationships with others. As an African American dad, how have you modeled this for your kids?
Very simply, my kids know that I've been a business owner. Mm-hmm. And as a business owner, I look to hire the right people for the job. And I look not to get stuck on biases, but really to hire people on their merit and their ability to do the task that I need done. So that has brought me into contact with all ethnicities. And through working and employing these people, and sometimes even partnering with them in business, I've come to understand their social views. I've come to understand just from an ethnic perspective what is important to them, what their value systems are. And they've come to understand mine as well. Mm-hmm. And where the kids are concerned, I always try to walk them through what that looks like and how valuable it is to have relationships beyond your own ethnicity. I think that it's important that we develop a worldview, but we also understand the worldview of others through their ethnic lens. And we try to teach the kids that. Mm-hmm.
As we close, I'd like to know if there's anything else as a Black man, a Black husband and father that you'd like to share with us?
Well, simply as a Black man, I mean, to everyone who's watching, please understand that it is hard. It has been harder than my white counterparts. My business partner reminds me sometimes, she's like, dude, I just wouldn't want to have to deal with some of the stuff you have to deal with. He's been there for some of the experiences as we've gotten off the elevator for meetings, and people have literally stopped in their tracks to try to figure out what I was doing there. And I was there for the same meeting he was there for. So that level of bias and sometimes discrimination is certainly prevalent in our society. And we are at a point in our country's history where we have a real opportunity to do something about that and to make long-lasting change that is required. To our kids, I would say, understand what you're up against. You have to understand it and embrace it. Don't be naive and think that your generation somehow is not required to deal with this because it's absolutely wrong, unfortunately. We've all done work to try to push this forward, but there's more work to be done. Embrace the work, take up the challenge, and do your part so that we can all have this change long term.
Thank you for hanging out with me today and for sharing some of your thoughts and insights. And if you'd like to know more about how to have the talk with your kids, here are some helpful resources. Embrace Race at embracerace.org, Parent Toolkit at parenttoolkit.com, and A Parent's Guide to Preventing and Responding to Prejudice at tolerance.org. There are also a number of books and programs that can be helpful in having these conversations. Many of these resources can be found by simply searching How to Talk to Kids and Teens About Race. As my parting thought, I'd like to leave you with this. While we can have the talk in terms of sex and sexuality, and the talk in terms of police brutality, we also need to have the talk with our children, all of our children, about the real inequalities that exist in our nation that allow this current system of oppression to thrive. We need to teach our children about the fight for access to health care, and the fight for jobs and equal pay, and the fight for fair housing, and the fight against voter suppression. These are the social ills that negatively impact minorities at disproportionate rates. All of these issues are interrelated and part of the systemic biases that played a role in there being a George Floyd, an Ahmaud Arbery, a Breonna Taylor, and a Rayshard Brooks. The bottom line is if we're going to fight to win, we need to be very clear on who and what we're actually fighting. I hope today's special series on The Talk was helpful. I pray that you've been motivated and inspired to make changes, big or small, that will help us all heal this racial divide. Join us for our next episode of Stress Less with Dr. SOS as we continue the talk and explore issues of racism, discrimination, and how to grow from there. In recognition of Father's Day, I'd like to say Happy Father's Day to all of the amazing dads out there making a difference in their families' lives, including my own dad, my husband, my godfather, and my spiritual father. I love and appreciate you all. Until next time, choose to live well.